Ladies and gentlemen, and the rest of us, please welcome to the stage Bob Gordon.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to bring the sunshine. It's been a hell of a year, so could we just have one more round of applause for our beautiful friends and colleagues who couldn't make it tonight. It's my honour tonight to present the first Hall of Fame induction, and that is for Paul McCarthy. So this may take a minute or 5.5, I'd say. A consummate singer-songwriter till the very end, Paul McCarthy was for decades a beloved and respected figure in the West Australian music industry and will continue to be so as time goes by. Paul's music career had an unusual beginning. Upon finishing at Balga Senior High School, he scored a job typing up letters for a recording studio. It led to a light bulb moment. In eventually helping to write ad jingles, Paul realised that he seemed to have a constant supply of melodies in his head. Upon this conclusion, he decided to quit the job, learn guitar, and find a new life as a singer-songwriter-musician. Paul's first band was a punk outfit called The Transplants. Formed in 1978, they also featured drummer Tony Polar, who would later play with the Beast Suburban and other bands. They were a fixture on the hectic Perth circuit of the time. After 6 months, Paul was booted from the band due to excessive drinking. It probably was hard to tell who was drinking the most, but apparently it was him. Although they asked him to continue as a songwriter, he refused, but it was a harbinger of things to come. Paul's songwriting prowess had not gone unnoticed, and a Perth cover band called The Boys, who had garnered national attention from record companies, gained a deal from Warner Music on the proviso that a certain Paul McCarthy would write their original songs. However, he would not perform. The band's 1980 self-titled debut album, led by the singles When You're Lonely, Hurt Me Babe, and the oddly titled Wayo, 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 saw them become quite the national sensation. Appearances on Countdown stoked the fire and led to huge crowds, shows across the country. There was a fever, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone. Amidst internal tensions, however, their second LP, Inside the Cage, would soundtrack the boys' demise. In 1981, feeling wounded but ultimately undeterred, Paul started to compose songs for his own sake. He began writing and performing with a band called the Doodlebugs before becoming involved in a seminal 1985 music collective called United Rock. With the Doodlebugs on the wane, he met a band on its last throes, also called Mutants of Desire. This was the beginning of one of the most formidable bands in WA music history, the Jackals. That was for me and Paul. There were several lineups, eras and cities for the Jackals, but it eventually came to roost back in Perth with the release of the Feel LP in 1993. Which saw Paul joined by guitarist Phil Bradley, bass player Howard Shawcross and drummer Howie Johnston. The album was released through Idaho Records, the label founded by Richard Lane of the Stems, also tragically one of our loved and lost in the last 12 months. The album is a cult classic and was acclaimed at the time by none other than Butch Vig, who was fresh off producing Nirvana's Nevermind album. By the mid-90s, the songwriter and his Jackals bandmates felt the need to move on. In doing so, Paul wrote and recorded a solo album with contributions from members of the West Australian Symphony Orchestra. Shortly afterwards, he took on the task of designing a music skills course for TAFE, which runs to this day. In the 2000s, he co-founded, edited and published Groove, a WA-devoted music magazine that ran for 5 years at a point when independent print publishing was beginning to become a near impossible exercise. By 2010, Paul was thirsting to play again. In the decade that followed, he formed groups where he was not only the singer, songwriter, and mentor to a host of up-and-coming players, but by his own admission, the recipient of new musical inspiration. As such, the Wishes, the Fortunatos, and his last band, Circus, who we'll hear from in a moment, not only benefited from Paul's huge back catalogue of songs, but revelled in his ever-ongoing intuition in terms of creativity and spontaneity. Throughout, his love of the Beatles was Paul's songwriting blueprint. In September last year, Paul McCarthy was diagnosed with late-stage cancer. He died just 3 weeks later on Saturday, October 3rd, 2020. This time in between saw an awesome parade of bandmates and friends visit the great man who inspired many and took inspiration from all. I last met with Paul on Monday, September 28. He said, "I'm getting to watch my own victory lap," from his hospital bed with his sonorous voice and those eyes that not so much peered into your soul, but reached in and sourced the best parts of your heart and presented them right back to you. In his description of being given the news about his 2 to 3 week prognosis, Paul related his response upon the end of that meeting. Quote, "I went outside and lit up the biggest fucking joint you've ever seen in your life." He continued, "It actually seemed funny. I mean, it's too late to be worrying about my health now." What do you say to that? Paul was one of a kind, always creating, always moving forward, always willing to share with others what he'd already been through and what he was going to encounter. Ultimately, he was at peace with his life's end, noting that music had made for a very fulfilling and happy experience indeed. Paul McCarthy was both interesting and interested, gifted and giving, a man for the ages who lived in our age. Last October, as plans were made for Paul's funeral, I was fortunate enough to meet and speak with his sister Tracy, who is here tonight with the family. Tracy related to me a seemingly random joke Paul made in his final days. He said, "What would it be like if the very last word someone spoke was, 'Ow'?" You'll be very impressed to know that Paul made good on that unusual notion. Like Spike Milligan, whose gravestone reads, "I told you I was ill," Paul was a brilliant mind right until the end. And with that said, it is indeed my honour to induct Paul McCarthy into the West Australian Music Hall of Fame. Thank you, Paul, for you and for every little thing. Ow! Oh, that's me.